The year is 1660. Stand at the southern tip of a long forested island. Behind you, an endless wilderness of ancient oak and chestnut forests. Before you, a harbor bristling with sailing ships from Amsterdam, London, and the Caribbean. You're standing in New Amsterdam, a tiny Dutch settlement of roughly 1,500 souls that will one day become the most powerful city in the world. But forget what you know about New York. Forget the skyscrapers, the subway, the yellow taxis. Strip all of it away. What you see instead are narrow brick houses with stepped gables, windmills turning in the harbor breeze, canals running through muddy streets, and a remarkable collection of people from a dozen nations speaking as many languages. This isn't frontier America as you imagine it, crude log cabins and desperate settlers. This is a sophisticated commercial city, chaotic and ambitious, already displaying the character that would define New York for centuries. Today, we're walking through New Amsterdam in 1660, not through famous battles or political decisions, but through how ordinary people actually lived, what they ate, where they worked, what their homes looked like, how they spent their days. This is daily life at the beginning of American urban history. New Amsterdam in 1660 occupied only the southern tip of Manhattan Island, a compact settlement of perhaps 300 buildings crammed onto land bordered by two rivers. Walking through it felt like being transported to a Dutch canal city. The Dutch West India Company had literally shipped pieces of Amsterdam across the Atlantic, not just people, but architectural culture, urban planning instincts, and commercial habits. Streets were narrow, unpaved, frequently muddy. The city had been pushing for stone pavement since the 1650s. Stone Street became the first paved road in the settlement when residents petitioned for improvement and contributed to its cost, a thoroughly Dutch approach, practical problems solved through collective commercial interest. Buildings were distinctively Dutch, narrow facades of yellow and red brick, stepped gable roofs visible above the rooflines, large windows admitting maximum light. These weren't primitive frontier structures. They were sophisticated urban buildings that would look comfortable in Amsterdam or Rotterdam. The city was divided by a canal, the Heergracht, running through the center, allowing small boats to reach warehouses directly from the harbor. Broad Street today follows exactly the path of that canal. In 1660, you'd see flat-bottomed boats laden with beaver pelts, grain, and trade goods gliding between rows of brick buildings. Fort Amsterdam anchored the southern tip, earthen and wooden walls containing a church, administrative buildings, barracks, and warehouses. It was less castle than corporate headquarters, which perfectly described what it was, the operational base of the Dutch West India Company's North American franchise. The city had no cathedral, no great monument, no triumphal arch. It had warehouses, taverns, a canal, and counting houses. This was a city built for commerce, not glory. New Amsterdam's population in 1660 was arguably the most diverse collection of people in North America. A visitor from Europe in 1643 recorded hearing 18 different languages spoken in the settlement. Dutch was official, but the streets filled with French, German, English, Portuguese, Swedish, Finnish, African languages, and the Lenape tongue of the indigenous people who still lived nearby and traded regularly. This diversity wasn't accidental or idealistic, it was commercial. The Dutch West India Company needed labor, skills, and trade connections. They weren't particular about origin. If you could work, trade, and contribute to company profits, you were welcome. Dutch settlers formed the ruling class, company officials, established merchants, large landowners. They lived in the better houses along Pearl Street, controlled the import-export trade and ran the administrative apparatus. But below them was a complex social world. German craftsmen built furniture and worked metal. French Huguenot refugees, Protestants fleeing Catholic persecution, brought skills in weaving, papermaking, and finance. English settlers from New England lived alongside their commercial rivals. Scandinavian sailors settled after service on company ships. Jews arrived in 1654, refugees from Recife, Brazil, after Portuguese forces ended Dutch rule there. Director General Peter Stuyvesant wanted to expel them. Company directors in Amsterdam overruled him, citing practical commercial reasons. These Jewish settlers became merchants and traders, establishing the pattern of New Amsterdam as a place where economic contribution mattered more than religious identity. Most consequentially, enslaved Africans formed a significant portion of the population. The Dutch West India Company actively transported enslaved people to their colonies. In New Amsterdam, they worked as laborers, domestic servants, skilled craftsmen, and agricultural workers. Dutch colonial slavery had some unusual features compared to what would later develop in English colonies. Some enslaved people achieved a legal status called half-freedom. They could own property, marry, and live somewhat independently, but remained bound to company service. This partial freedom was unique, but still fundamentally unjust. The Africans of New Amsterdam built the city's infrastructure, while their freedom remained conditional and precarious. New Amsterdam was above all a working city. Everyone worked. There were no idle gentlemen, no aristocratic leisure class. The Dutch had no patience for unproductive people. The most prestigious work was international trade. Merchant families like the Van Cortlands and Steenwicks operated complex businesses connecting New Amsterdam to Amsterdam, the Caribbean, Brazil, and West Africa. Their warehouses along Pearl Street held beaver pelts from the interior, tobacco from Virginia, sugar from the islands, and manufactured goods from Europe. These merchants employed clerks who kept meticulous ledgers, recording every transaction in the precise double-entry bookkeeping the Dutch had perfected. Accounting wasn't bureaucracy, it was survival. In a commercial city, your books were your reputation. Artisans formed the backbone of the working community. Blacksmiths kept essential tools and hardware flowing. Carpenters built and maintained the wooden structures that formed most of the city. Bricklayers constructed the more substantial buildings. Coopers made the barrels that stored and shipped everything. Tanners processed animal hides. Brewers supplied the taverns. Shipbuilding occupied a significant workforce. Ships were the city's lifeline. Building, maintaining, and repairing vessels was constant, skilled work. The East River waterfront rang with hammers and saws from early morning until the light failed. Farming continued within and around the settlement. Most households maintained kitchen gardens. Larger farms, boweries, occupied land north of the town, supplying fresh vegetables, grain, and livestock. Farming here was more sophisticated than English frontier agriculture, reflecting Dutch agricultural expertise developed in a densely populated homeland where every acre was maximized. Women worked throughout. Widows often continued their late husbands' businesses. The law recognized this. Women ran shops, taverns, and boarding houses. They managed household production, brewing, baking, preserving, sewing, dairy work. A Dutch household was an economic unit, not just a domestic one, and women were partners in that economic enterprise. What did ordinary people's homes actually look like, and how did families live inside them? A prosperous merchant's house on Pearl Street would surprise you with its comfort and sophistication. The exterior said wealth, fine brickwork, large windows, decorated gable. Inside, the ground floor served as counting house and storage. Business happened at home, always. Upstairs were living quarters, remarkable for their furnishings. Persian carpets covered floors. Chinese porcelain, blue and white Delftware, or actual imports, displayed on shelves and mantels. Heavy oak furniture filled rooms, a massive cabinet for linens and valuables, a carved bed with curtains for warmth and privacy, chairs and a table for dining. These weren't luxury displays, they were investments. Merchant families stored wealth in portable goods because cash was always scarce and banking primitive. That Persian carpet and those Chinese cups represented liquid assets as much as decoration. Working families lived more simply. A craftsman's house might have one main room with a sleeping loft above. Furniture was minimal but functional. A table, benches rather than chairs, iron pots and wooden utensils for cooking, a sleeping area curtained for privacy. These homes were warm, practical, and sufficient, not comfortable by modern standards, but far from desperate poverty. Heating came from massive fireplaces, Dutch style, with deep hearths designed for both warmth and cooking. Women spent significant time fire management, keeping flames appropriate for different tasks, banking fires overnight to preserve coals, managing fuel supplies through winter. Beer was safer than water, and everyone drank it, including children, though in smaller quantities. Dutch brewing traditions meant relatively good, consistent beer available throughout the city. Contemporary observers complained, sometimes admiringly, sometimes in horror, that New Amsterdam had an extraordinary number of taverns for its size. By the 1650s, roughly 1 in 4 buildings in the settlement was a tavern, tippling house, or establishment selling alcohol. This shocked visitors from more austere English colonies, but it reflected Dutch culture and practical urban necessity. The tavern was everything a modern city distributes across dozens of specialized institutions. It was the news exchange, where ships' arrivals, prices in Amsterdam, and political developments were first discussed. It was the employment market. Craftsmen found work, and merchants found labor in tavern conversations. It was the meeting hall. Business contracts were negotiated and concluded over beer. It was the hotel. Travelers lodged in taverns. It was the community center. Celebrations, funerals, and civic gatherings happened there. Step into a Pearl Street tavern in 1660. The air is thick with pipe smoke, clay pipes, the long-stemmed Dutch variety. The smell of roasting meat, beer, and unwashed bodies created an atmosphere nothing like modern restaurants. Tables were heavy wood, stained with decades of spilled beer. Benches ran alongside walls and surrounded tables. Candles provided flickering light. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, serving as both heat source and cooking range. The clientele mixed dramatically. A Dutch merchant discussing prices with an English trader. A German craftsman explaining his work to a French refugee. A sailor recently arrived from Amsterdam sharing news from Europe. Lenape traders sometimes sat separately, conducting their business with city merchants. Free black residents drank alongside white residents. The social lines were complex and inconsistent. This was practical integration driven not by enlightened values, but by commercial necessity. In a city where everyone needed to do business with everyone else, excessive social separation was bad for trade. New Amsterdam ended abruptly at its northern boundary, a wooden wall and earthwork running across the island from river to river. This wasn't a grand fortification. It was a practical, defensive barrier, its wooden posts 12 feet tall, marking the boundary between the Dutch settlement and everything beyond. Citizen soldiers, the same bakers, coopers, and merchants who traded by day, patrolled the wall's perimeter, armed with muskets. The wilderness beyond the wall wasn't empty. The Lenape people, the original inhabitants of Manhattan, maintained villages, hunting grounds, and trading routes throughout the island. Relations between the Dutch settlement and the Lenape were constantly complicated. Trade created interdependence. The entire beaver pelt industry, the foundation of New Amsterdam's wealth, depended on Lenape hunters and traders, bringing furs to Dutch merchants. Without this relationship, the city's economic reason for existence collapsed. But settlement created conflict. Dutch farmers pushing north for agricultural land encroached on Lenape territory. The resulting tensions periodically exploded into violence. Governor Willem Kieft had launched devastating raids against Lenape villages in the 1640s that killed hundreds and created lasting hostility. By 1660, an uneasy peace existed, but the underlying conflict between European settlement expansion and indigenous land rights was irreconcilable. Beyond the wall, the Boweries, the Dutch farms, occupied cleared land in what is today Lower and Midtown Manhattan. Farm families lived more isolated existences than city residents, their lives determined by agricultural seasons rather than commercial ones. They brought produce to city markets regularly, connecting the rural and urban economies. Further north, Manhattan remained what it had been for millennia: forested land with streams, ponds, and wildlife the European settlers barely knew existed. In September 1664, 4 English warships appeared in New York Harbor, their guns trained on Fort Amsterdam and the fragile city behind it. Director General Peter Stuyvesant, the autocratic, wooden-legged administrator who'd run the colony for 17 years, climbed the fort's walls and looked at the English fleet. He wanted to fight. His merchants didn't. The Dutch West India Company's investment in New Amsterdam was a commercial enterprise, not a military one. The city's leading merchants calculated quickly: resistance would destroy their warehouses, sink their ships, and end their businesses. Surrender would preserve everything physical, even if it changed the flag flying over Fort Amsterdam. They wrote to Stuyvesant collectively, politely, firmly, "Don't fight." Stuyvesant reportedly tore the letter into pieces in fury. Then he read it anyway. Then he surrendered. On September 8, 1664, New Amsterdam became New York, renamed for the Duke of York, brother of King Charles II of England, to whom the king had granted the territory. The practical genius of the handover was what didn't change. English governance replaced Dutch, yes. The fort was renamed Fort James. Dutch currency was eventually phased out. But the merchants kept their businesses. The craftsmen kept their trades. The diverse population kept their positions. Even many Dutch legal customs continued under the new administration. The English inherited a sophisticated commercial city already shaped by decades of diverse immigration, pragmatic governance, and trade-first values. They couldn't have built what existed there. They simply took it and continued it. Walking through Lower Manhattan today, the ghost of New Amsterdam persists beneath everything. The street pattern of the financial district follows Dutch property lines established in the 1640s and 50s. The crooked, narrow streets that confuse visitors expecting American grid patterns are Dutch streets that simply stayed. Broad Street follows the Heergracht Canal. Pearl Street follows the original shoreline. Stone Street is still Stone Street. The concept of Wall Street began literally as the wall. When the English demolished the wooden palisade to allow the city's expansion northward, the path running alongside it became a street. Financial activity that had clustered near the wall continued there. The connection between defensive infrastructure and financial infrastructure is accidental but complete. The diversity that defines modern New York traces directly to Dutch policy. The decision to allow Jewish settlement in 1654, the practice of welcoming skilled workers regardless of national origin, the pragmatic tolerance of multiple religious practices, These weren't noble principles, they were commercial decisions, but they established patterns that subsequent waves of immigration reinforced and expanded. Even everyday American culture carries Dutch fingerprints. The word cookie comes from the Dutch koekje. Santa Claus derives from Sinterklaas, the Dutch St. Nicholas tradition. Easter egg hunting has Dutch origins. New York's distinctive apartment living culture evolved from the narrow Dutch urban house design. New Amsterdam existed for only 40 years under that name. It was never large, 1,500 people at its peak. It was never powerful. A single English squadron ended it without a battle. But it established something more durable than power, a pattern. New Amsterdam may be gone, but every time someone arrives in New York with nothing but ambition and finds opportunity among strangers from everywhere, they're experiencing exactly what Dutch merchants, German craftsmen, French refugees, Jewish traders, and African workers experienced 360 years ago. The name changed, the spirit never did.